Hello, good evening. I hope you're well. Today, we are going to be talking about something which has come up in recent events. As many of you will know, this has been a very sad and strange time in the United Kingdom because our Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, passed away last week. And for many of us, she is the only monarch we have ever known. So the processes that mark the transition from one monarch to another we are unfamiliar with. This is something totally new to many of us. And we're witnessing for the first time ceremonies which are centuries old and learning so much about British constitutional history and the significance of various rites and rituals. Today, I want to discuss one of these rituals, which concerns the accession of a monarch, which we saw for the first time on television when King Charles went through this ritual. They displayed it on the BBC. I think it was last Friday or Saturday. And this effectively marks the beginning of his reign. Although from the moment of Elizabeth's death, he was king, this ceremony is essential because it is the king's way of affirming the British Constitution, swearing to uphold various parts of it. Now, one of the things that came up during this ceremony was a specific act, a specific oath, which was related to the Church of Scotland. Charles was required, and he said as the following: I understand that the law requires that I should, at my accession to the crown, take and subscribe the oath relating to the security of the Church of Scotland. I am ready to do so at this first opportunity. I, Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of my other realms and territories, King, Defender of the Faith, do faithfully promise and swear that I shall inviolably maintain and preserve the settlement of the true Protestant religion as established by the laws made in Scotland, in prosecution of the claim of right, and particularly by an act entitled An Act for Securing the Protestant Religion and Presbyterian Church Government, and by the acts passed in the Parliament of both kingdoms for the union of the two kingdoms, together with the government, worship, discipline, rights, and privileges of the Church of Scotland. So help me God. This this oath kind of jumped out during the ceremony. Everything else seemed to fit quite nicely. There was the affirmation of the various acts connected with the union of the parliaments of Scotland and England. There was a commitment to uphold the British Constitution as it is maintained. But then we have this surprising declaration, especially as there doesn't seem to be any alternative or requisite declaration for the Church of England, for example, or the Church of Ireland. Why is it that the Church of Scotland, uniquely amongst the Christian denominations or religions for that matter, gets this oath during this ceremony? What's its importance? When did it originate and why did it appear? And I really want to go into this today because it's something that I noticed that there wasn't very much coverage of during the discussions. You have these constitutional historians coming on the TV, but this is the one bit they didn't address. So I'm going to try and give us a bit of history here, why this might be in here, what its significance is. And really, to do that, we need to look at Scottish religious, cultural, and political history from the 16th century for about a couple of hundred years. And I think we'll see some interesting tensions here that emerge over time and how these help to shape the British Constitution. And if there's time at the end, we may be able to ask some questions about perhaps what its significance might be moving forwards. But be that as it may, before we get into it, just to say, if you want to guarantee that your comment or question is addressed, please send a super chat. This is going to be a 1 hour stream. It's very tightly packed today, so I can't guarantee I'll be able to engage with the rest of the chat. So if you want to guarantee that, please send a super chat. So without further ado, let's begin. So we have to start our story with the Protestant Reformation in Scotland, which took place in 1560. It was relatively late for a European Reformation. If you think the English one takes place in the 1530s, you've already had Reformations in Lutheran Germany, Calvin's Geneva, and so on. Scotland is relatively late to the party. This is in part because this is the moment where, using the English army or Elizabeth's army, the Scottish reformers are able to overthrow the French-backed regime, which allows for the formation of Protestantism, uh, backed by the Parliament. And one of the benefits of this lateness, is that Scotland can draw on the other Reformations for what you might call a pre-packaged Reformation program. They're able to bring in a liturgy from Geneva, a form of church government informed by the experiences of men like John Knox while they were disciples of John Calvin. And so we could see this as very much a top-down Reformation. This is starting with the backing of the Scottish Parliament, and it's being imposed upon every parish within Scotland. Now, this is a relatively slow process. Although the official religion changes in 1560, it takes probably about 50 years before you can say that across Scotland, Protestant worship is the norm in parish worship. By the 17th century, we've reached a point where your average Scot would identify as a Scottish Protestant, and they are participating in a form of worship which focuses on the word of God being preached, that there is metrical psalm singing, the Bible being read, prayers in communal prayers in Scots or English. And these are all significant Protestant deviations from the practice of the Mass, which would have been uh, what was encountered before. So some scholars have suggested that the transition was really achieved through the formation of these distinctive Protestant identity markers or badges, which formed a new identity which people enjoyed. So I mentioned psalm singing, right? The in the mass, in the medieval mass, the congregation did not sing. The clergy and maybe a choir might sing, but parishioners were not expected to sing hymns. This was really something which was introduced by Luther in Wittenberg. He was a great hymn writer, and he believed that the congregation should be able to sing the word of God. And this was because music stirs our hearts, it more surely supplants within us the truth of God's word. And so the Scottish reformers take this on, but rather than writing hymns, they just want the Psalms because they are inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so this is a new experience, men, women, and children singing together in worship, and they seem to have enjoyed it. Psalm books were one of the best sellers during this period in a small book trade in Scotland. And it seems that although this was initially not an essential part of public worship, congregations demanded it, and it became a feature, a fixed feature. And because it was so identified with Protestantism, it becomes a kind of sign or symbol of our new identity as Protestants, as Scottish Protestants. Because, of course, these are not just any old tunes, these are tunes that were specific to Scottish worship. And these were paraphrases specific to Scottish worship. So, what you find is by the early 17th century, in the most part, most Scottish people would be Protestants, that they participate in a common form of worship, which is largely consistent across Scotland, that there's a common Calvinist or Reformed theology and spirituality. Within this, though, the main divisions during the period relate to ecclesiology, that is, the structure of the church, and how the church relates to the crown, to the state, to the monarch. And essentially, two visions uh, are in conflict throughout this period. The first one I want to draw our attention to, it really comes about with what's called the Second Book of Discipline. The First Book of Discipline comes about in 1560, and it basically is a manual for the form of the church. What should its structure be? How should it be uh, run? What kind of administration is required? What ceremonies for appointing ministers? That sort of thing. The Second Book of Discipline, which we're looking at the 1570s and 80s here, is pushed by what we might call the hardcore Presbyterian faction. I'll come to what Presbyterian means in a second. This is headed up by a man called Andrew Melville, who was a very zealous Scottish Protestant who had spent considerable time on the continent and was something of a Renaissance humanist. He took on the idea of reading classical texts and biblical texts in their original languages, and also moving beyond just Aristotle, who in the medieval framework was the predominant philosophical figure, to maybe include other classical voices. And he was a university principal. He reformed the education system in Glasgow and St Andrews, not without resistance, of course. But he was quite a brilliant man. But he was also a leading figure within the Church of Scotland, and in this period, he puts forward this idea with others that there are two kingdoms. Essentially, you have the spiritual kingdom, which has as its head Jesus Christ, the king of the spiritual realm, and the church is on earth, the visible space where that is to be. And you have the temporal kingdom, the kingdom of this world, which is governed by the state, by the king, and so on. And these two kingdoms should not interfere or should not directly interfere with the governance of each other. This is an idea that we find in the medieval era as well. I think Pope Innocent, who was involved with launching the Crusades, articulated a similar notion. For Melville, though, the spiritual kingdom takes precedent over the temporal kingdom. The temporal kingdom is there to uphold true religion within society through the sword, essentially. It must administer discipline or support the church is attempts to discipline heretics, sinners, etc., etc. And if it fails to do this, it must be reprimanded from the pulpit. However, the church should not be running the society. So we can see there's a bit of a tension there, right? And obviously, this gives a lot of power to the church. But this was essentially his idea: two kingdoms, with Christ as the head of the Church of Scotland, and this would be reflected in a Presbyterian form of church government. Presbyterianism, well, Melville would say this was the form of government found in the Bible, in the pages of the New Testament, taking its name from the presbyters. And essentially, it consists in a series of committees or councils. So at your local church, you would have a council made up of the minister and elders that are lay people ordained to specific authority within the church. And this would be called a Accession. They would control or run the church, your local church. Then your region, so a collection of churches, would be in a presbytery. And this would involve ministers and some elders from each of the churches coming to make decisions. At a national level, you have the General Assembly. And again, this is ministers and elders from across Scotland coming together to make decisions. The king should not have any control in this area. Indeed, civil authorities should not try to intervene. That was the idea for Melville. They can be there, they can make suggestions, but they cannot legislate, they cannot mandate certain things within the church. So this is Melville's idea, and this is what the Presbyterians essentially push for throughout this period. The other vision, however, is that what we might call Episcopalian. And this is the idea that the church should be structured, have a hierarchy which is under bishops. So you have your local churches, but then rather than being under presbyteries, they are under the authority of a bishop. And these bishops themselves would be under the authority of the king. And this model essentially would mirror the Church of England, which has during this period a system of bishops who claim to be in continuity with the apostolic succession and have as the supreme governor of the Church of England the monarch, so Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. Unsurprisingly, the people that push this the most are the kings. So the king who was primarily in the late 16th century and early 17th century is James VI of Scotland. And when he becomes king of England in 1603, he starts to really push this into the Church of Scotland in a much stronger way. He's in a position of strength at this point. While he was in Scotland, he had to deal with competing factions in his court, and he was prone to the threats of power from rival nobles in Scotland. The English court is a very secure and strong place. It's certainly far away from Scotland, so there's no threat of, for example, he was kidnapped for 6 months at one point. That's not going to happen in England. It's a very different social system, and the Tudors had effectively undermined that sort of activity against him. So he starts pushing for the Church of Scotland to be brought into conformity with the Church of England. He uses this sort of language. He calls for, well, first he introduces bishops back into the Church of Scotland. So you have this very messy system where you have presbyteries, but they are being run by bishops. He then calls for the formation of a new liturgy, which is more akin to the English liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer. And this goes through various drafts and redrafts. There's committees for this purpose. He then, things are going reasonably well at this point. This is around 1615, 1616. 1618, we have the introduction of what are called the 5 Articles of Perth. That is from the Perth General Assembly that the king had put forward to the assembly. And these consisted in 5 changes to what takes place in Scottish worship. The first is that there should be kneeling at communion. So in the Scottish practice of the period, it was regulated by what we might call the regulative principle. That is, worship should only consist in that which is explicitly sanctioned by the Bible. Anything that is not explicitly sanctioned by the Bible is prohibited. That was John Knox's view. So when it came to communion, they took the Lord's Supper and tried to literally translate it into the worship of the church. So we find that Jesus is sitting with his disciples round a table as they enjoy a meal together and then celebrate the Last Supper. So, by extension, the communion should be practiced in the same way. Scottish Protestants sat round a table, and the minister would say the words of institution. He would explain what was going on. He would bless the elements, the bread and the wine, and then distribute it, and they would pass it round together. James, following the English practice in the Church of England, says, no, you have to kneel at communion. You have to kneel, and the minister will distribute the elements to you as you are kneeling. You then have additional things so the other 4 articles are baptism can be outside of public worship, that confirmation should be administered by a bishop, the reintroduction of saints' days and certain festivals such as Christmas and Easter, these had been abolished. And the 5th one, if you just give me a second. It's gone out of my head, I'm afraid. um, Come back to me when I'm least expecting it. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, that's it. Private communion for the sick or infirm. So, most of these didn't cause major issue for James, but the primary one that did was kneeling at the Lord's Supper, because this wasn't explicitly in the Bible, and it was seen by quite a number of Scots as essentially a Catholic practice, a Roman Catholic practice. You have to understand that. Well, let's go back a second. For Carl Schmitt, every political community, every genuine political community exists via the friend-enemy distinction. You have an inner ring of those who belong to this community, who are in, we might say, solidarity, who share the same political theology, and this has to be defined against its enemies, those who pose an existential threat to the community. For the Scottish Protestant Church, that existential enemy is Catholicism, and there was a huge drive to instill an anti-Catholic sentiment within the population, and by and large, it seemed to have been quite effective. And so, when you end up with something kneeling before communion, like they would have done during the Mass, it appears as a Catholic thing, and this is thus a threat to the Scottish Protestant hegemony. Not least as well because you have to remember the context. There'd been the Spanish Armada. There was constant fears that Catholic imperial powers were going to try and invade Scotland, such as France. So this wasn't just a kind of pie in the sky idea. There was a genuine possibility that Catholicism could be brought back in. So James kind of backs off from this a bit. He passes the law and Parliament passes it in 1621, but he doesn't enforce it. He knows this is going to be too politically dangerous. But then his son, Charles I, ascends to the throne in 1625. And there's lots of debate about Charles I, and we won't go into it here. But essentially, he tries to push what he believes to be true religion onto Scotland. That is, bringing it into conformity with a high form of Anglicanism, that which celebrates the beauty of holiness. It is very ordered, it is very scripted, and this conflicts quite strongly with the extempore and charismatic aspects of Scottish Protestantism, which really sought to open space up for the freedom of the Holy Spirit to come in and produce all manner of experiences during this period. So Charles really implements the 5 Articles of Perth and punishes those ministers who will not kneel at communion. He deposes them, he imprisons them. He also then moves in 1636 to introduce a book of canons, which will govern the worship and administration of the Church of Scotland in a way that's similar to the Church of England. And in 1637, he brings in the Book of Common Prayer, the Scottish Book of Common Prayer. This isn't identical to the English Book of Common Prayer that's used in the Church of England during this period. There are some slight changes, but they're very minor, and the tone, the style, the substance is essentially like the Church of England's. Now, famously in St. Giles, which, if you were watching the news yesterday, Queen Elizabeth's casket was placed in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. Well, this was the first place that this new Book of Common Prayer was read, and so we are told by the legends. A woman called Jenny Geddes got up and got her stool and threw it at the minister who was reading this, and a riot started, and lots of women were throwing stones and sticks at the minister for reading the Book of Common Prayer. It was so violent, in fact, that in some places, ministers were reading this prayer book with a revolver sat on the on the pulpit for their own protection. Now, while this legend is not quite true, Jenny Geddes actually belongs to a later riot. The spirit of it is correct. There was riots in the street about this prayer book, and it motivated a large scale protest movement amongst the nobility and the clergy, culminating in what is known as the National Covenant of 1638. The National Covenant called on all the people of Scotland to uphold two things: true religion, as defined as being against innovation, as being based solely on the Bible, and whilst not explicitly Presbyterian, it later becomes interpreted as true religion as being Presbyterian. And secondly, to uphold the king. Now, this is a clever little move because the National Covenant's essentially saying then, well, we resist the king's policy, but we are not trying to get rid of the king. We just think he or his advisors, like Archbishop William Laud, are desperately wrong on this matter. We cannot go against God. We must we must change his mind. We must show that he is wrong on this. So this gets sworn in, and across Scotland, parishes across Scotland, thousands of people swear allegiance to the National Covenant. Some of them even signing it in their own blood. And this isn't just hyperbole. We actually have many copies of the National Covenant, and it's been shown that there's actually blood signatures on there. And in time, this leads to warfare between the Covenanters, as they're known, and Charles I. He loses these wars. He requires money to raise another army from England, and that's how we see the ball rolling for the English Civil War, because Parliament is recalled. During this period, Scotland becomes Presbyterian. Indeed, the Covenanters seek to, in their view, fulfill the promise of the Scottish Reformation and to pursue a puritanical form of Presbyterianism. They're able to do so. And this is tied in with what's known as the Westminster Assembly. During the English Civil War, the Parliament made an agreement with the Scottish Covenanters that the Scots would come in on their side and support them, and were often quite key to winning key battles like the Battle of Marston Moor, if the English would take on Presbyterianism and, in fact, develop for England, Scotland, and Ireland, because Ireland was one of the realms of the crown, a national Presbyterianism. And this took place during the Westminster Assembly, which produced the Westminster Confession and the Westminster Catechisms and the Westminster Directory for Public Worship. And although in England this didn't get taken on, in Scotland this became the dominant form for governing church structure, for governing worship, and so on. And this continues when, in 1651, Cromwell invades Scotland and actually removes the Covenanters who are in charge. Now, this happens because Cromwell has executed Charles I. This is in part because, although, again, there's debates about this, but let's just say for now that although Cromwell was willing to keep Charles alive, when a group called the Engagers from Scotland tried to break Charles out of prison or his imprisonment, Cromwell decides, well, he's too dangerous to be kept alive. He's never going to keep the peace. When Charles I is executed, Scotland declare Charles II to be their new king in 1651. Now, Cromwell saw this as a threat, so he invades Scotland, and he, had great troops. They had an excellent general in Alexander Leslie, who had fought in the 30 Years' War on the continent. But at the Battle of Dunbar, they famously lost when the ministers apparently told the men to go down the hill to face Cromwell. Why do you go down the hill? It was a terrible idea. Anyway, they lose, but the Westminster Assembly and its provisions continues to be the dominant form in Scotland. That is until, however, in 1660, the restoration of the monarchy in England. Charles II returns and he becomes King of England. He's already King of Scotland, but he's become King of England too. And while in 1651 he had promised to uphold the Covenant and Presbyterianism in Scotland, well, he's in England now and he's got the power, and he is not doing that. He passes the Rescissory Act in 1661. And basically, what that does is it does away with all the laws that were passed between 1640 and 1660. So that's 20 years of laws that are done away with. So that does away with all of the laws which institute the puritanical Presbyterianism of the Covenanters. It does away with all the appointments of ministers who were appointed on the basis of allegiance to the National Covenant and to the Westminster forms of worship. So 400 ministers are expelled from their posts in Scotland. Similar things happen in the Church of England, and mass imprisonment of radical dissenting groups like Quakers and Baptists takes place under Charles II. In Scotland, the main persecution takes place around 1679 onwards, and this is called the Killing Times. Whilst there was a kind of mainstream Presbyterianism which was passively resistant, you have in the southwest of Scotland what has traditionally been a Presbyterian hardcore stronghold, and they were loyal to the National Covenant, and they didn't believe that they could affirm both loyalty to the king and to the National Covenant, to true religion in their view. So they rebel, primarily led by a man called Richard Cameron, who declares this to be the case, that he's choosing loyalty to God over loyalty to the king, and his followers, the Cameronians, form military resistance. They are easily defeated multiple times. You have in 1679 the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, where the government forces essentially crush this resistance. But what you find is, just like in the 1620s and 30s, when those who didn't want to kneel at communion went to open air communions for Presbyterians, you find this happening again during this period. Thousands of people, up to 4,000 coming from all across the local area to celebrate communion by sitting around the table. These preachers who were there, people like Richard Cameron, they are risking their lives. The death penalty is given to those who are found doing this, and actually it is passed in 1680, I think it is. No, 1685, sorry. 1685. It's extrajudicial killings are permitted by the government if they find one of these preachers and they don't swear loyalty to the crown and reject the National Covenant, swear an oath of abjuration. And indeed, every public office in Scotland required that you swear this oath of abjuration. So there's a massive shift here, isn't there? We've had puritanical Presbyterianism. Now we have what Charles II's brought in, which is a restoration of Episcopalianism within the Church of Scotland, and a severe persecution of anyone who holds to the Presbyterianism of the Covenanters. So this is friend-enemy distinctions all over the place. Well, James VII, who's James II of England, continues this policy. He ascends to the crown in 1685. But whereas Charles II was externally an Anglican, he may well have been a Roman Catholic, but to the public, he was an Anglican. James VII was an open Roman Catholic, and this caused severe issues because you have a predominantly Protestant Scotland and England being ruled by a Roman Catholic king. This is especially concerning given the precedent set after the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was devastating. I think 7 million people died during that war. Was that each country would follow the religion of its monarch, and that was the way to maintain peace. So if you have a Protestant king, you have a Protestant country. If you have a Catholic king, you have a Catholic country. Now, there had been a succession of Protestant kings in Scotland and England, but now we have a Catholic king. So what happens there? We get into this issue because James wasn't content to uphold the religious norm. He wanted to, and I think quite reasonably, and from his perspective, he wanted to get away from some of the the penalties that were placed on Roman Catholics. So he passed various laws to negate the punitive measures which were legally required of when if you were a professing Roman Catholic. Um, and in its most extreme, for example, we find Roman Catholics executed because of their faith. So he's trying to negate these things, and this comes to the fore in 1687, where he makes a declaration of indulgence, or what's also known as a declaration of the liberty of conscience, in which he declares that both Roman Catholics and Protestant dissenters, such as Quakers and Baptists, should not be penalized for their religious beliefs. Although he's much more willing to extend this to Catholics than he is to Protestants or Presbyterians, such as the Cameronians, right? The Cameronians, their faith is not tolerated. It's Roman Catholics primarily. Moreover, he insists that he tries to clear out in his government any member of the government who's not loyal or willing to uphold this oath, this new declaration. And he places Catholics in a series of significant places within his government. He then, in 1688, insists that every parish in England, the vicar must go into the pulpit and read out this declaration of the liberty of conscience. Now, the Church of England is very unhappy with this declaration as it is, because if you think this is allowing for religious toleration, well, mainstream religious institutions had for hundreds of years maintained their monopoly and dominance upon the culture by discipline, by punitive measures. So, and if you want examples of these, you can find on a previous stream, I think it was called Bridling Desire, discussion of how the Church of Scotland used punitive measures, discipline, humiliation, to create an emotional community, a hegemony over the ways people thought and felt and expressed their religious beliefs. James II or Seventh is undermining this. He's taking that away. He's saying, actually, you can have whatever faith you want and you won't be punished. So there's no risk from leaving the Church of England now. And then he's telling the Church of England, you must read this from your pulpits. You must declare it because, well, I guess this would have been the main place people would encounter the news at that time. The Archbishop of Canterbury, and I think it's about 6 bishops, write a letter in complaint. And James arrests them on the basis of sedition. This causes a domino effect, and essentially many Scots and English are willing to invite William of Orange to become the new king with his wife Mary, securing a Protestant nation. They were afraid that James VII was going to introduce Catholicism through this Toleration Act, and so we have the Glorious Revolution, as it's so called. In Scotland, whilst William was tempted to allow Episcopalianism to continue, he is forced essentially by the General Assembly, which meets for the first time in 1690 for many, many years, to uphold Presbyterianism. And to this day, the Church of Scotland has been Presbyterian. The Episcopalians became their own distinct church at that time, but were no longer the national church, or the church which could claim to be in every parish. We see here the official split. Fast forward then to 1705, and this is where we're going to see where this oath in the Accession comes from now. But this, hopefully you'll be able to see why I've gone through all of that to get to this point. For in 1705, we start to have discussions between the Scottish and English parliaments about an Act of Union. Queen Anne, who was the successor to William and Mary, is now the monarch, and she'd been pushing for integration for a number of years between these two countries. From the Scottish point of view, this, again, there's going to be lots of debate about this, but for just in kind of brief, there was an economic crisis during this period. There'd been, during the 1690s, periods of severe famine and devastating harvests. There were issues with trade, particularly as privateers were attacking vessels from Scotland to England. And these were English privateers, often. But more than anything, the Darien scheme, this plan where mainly funded by Scottish investors and had lots of monetary support from significant people in Scotland, to plant a colony in, I believe it was Panama. Now, this was an absolute disaster and almost bankrupted Scotland in the process. And so Scotland came to this looking for money, essentially. They needed money. And part of the arrangement was going to be, if there was this Act of Union, if the two parliaments united into one parliament for a new kingdom, the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, as it would have been called back then, Great Britain of Scotland and England, then they would receive financial support, free trade with England, and the privateers would be dealt with by the English. So this was a good economic deal for Scotland in that regard. But there was a lot of opposition to it, not least because there had always been this strong national identity of independence from England. This had been fomented by the stories of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce resisting the tyrannical invasion of Edward I, and then throwing out the English. And you can see that this is still here with us, insofar as every time you see Scotland play sport, so if it's rugby or football, we'll sing Flower of Scotland, and it's all about this. Proud Edward's army, we sent him home to think again, and all that sort of thing. So there was a lot of opposition, and the Church of Scotland was officially opposed to the Act of Union of 1707. Now, this wasn't just because its members were against it for the kind of national reasons I've just described, but also because of these theological tensions that we've been looking at throughout the last 100 years or so. There was a fear that union with England also meant union with the Church of England, and that would mean the reintroduction of bishops, so the abolition of Presbyterianism, that the head of the church would no longer be Jesus Christ as represented or mediated through the General Assembly, but actually it was going to be the monarch. And in turn, when these two things had happened in the past, well, we're going to start seeing more what would be perceived as Roman Catholic liturgy being introduced. And indeed, we might even have full blown Roman Catholicism. It paves the way for somebody like James VII to reintroduce Catholicism again. So the Church of Scotland is against it for these ecclesiological reasons too. It wants Presbyterianism and it doesn't want the monarch interfering. It wants the two kingdoms idea. Well, to get the Church of Scotland on side, to quell their opposition, the Parliaments pass an act which declares that the monarch will uphold the independence of the Church of Scotland. It will not be forced to become part of the Church of England or an extension of it. It will remain its own entity. In addition, they will uphold the Church of Scotland's Protestant faith. That is, its Presbyterianism. It won't be forced to become Episcopalian or any other denomination. It can remain Presbyterian and safe in that, and the monarch will defend that right from other pressures. So this becomes a key part of the means by which the Act of Union is passed. For the Church of Scotland then officially removes its open hostility to the Act of Union, though many of its members, its clergy, its laity are fully resistant. And then, so this is in 1707. The next accession to the throne was by George I. And this follows from the 1701 Act of Settlement, which refers to the head of the Church of England and the Church of Ireland, which is the monarch. And as these are Protestant churches, the monarch by this act had to be a Protestant. It ruled out Roman Catholics. It was an anti-Jacobite or Stuart proposal. And it secured this idea that a Protestant nation would have a Protestant king or queen. With the death of Anne, the closest relative was Sophia, but she died just a couple of months before Anne, and her son, George, from the House of Hanover, became king. And as part of his accession, he had to uphold this act defending the independence of the Church of Scotland in his accession ceremony, because he was upholding the British Constitution. He had to affirm it. And so this is the first time we see this oath in a British accession ceremony, because it's the first British monarch that we have. So this ceremony, this ritual that we saw Charles III perform, has its roots in Scottish religious, political, and cultural history, as it affects British constitutional origins and its history. It's at the very heart of the beginning of Great Britain, and it was indeed a key factor in why the Act of Union took place. If this hadn't been there probably would have been too much religious resistance with the fears of the anti-Catholicism of the Church of Scotland, its desire for a Presbyterian form of government, and its resistance to a monarch having sovereignty over its affairs. These factors require this oath to be in the it requires an act for the Act of Union to take place, and then for this oath to be part of the monarch's accession, because they're promising to uphold that settlement. And so ever since, we've had that as part of the accession ceremony. So I hope you can see that this oath really taps into something quite deep in our country's past. That it's something which speaks to so many events and all the political wranglings and the religious values and meanings to the Scottish people. and how that played out over the succession of a series of who kings and queens who wrestled with these issues and tried to implement their own ideas about what true religion consists in, and how that played out with these various factions, the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians. So, yes, that is the origin of the oath to uphold the independence of the Church of Scotland. We have maybe 5 minutes if anybody has any questions. Please feel free to send in super chats on that front. Good to see so many of you here, and I'm seeing some very familiar names. Great to see you all. And for those lurkers as well, good to see you too. While I'm waiting just to see, I think one of the interesting things here is that during the time that I've been talking about, the Church of Scotland, as the Church of England, was the dominant religious institution within the country. Certainly in 1560, there may have been minor Catholic communities, so some significant, like in Glasgow during the period, but in general, everybody attended the parish church. It was where the local community met. It was part of being a member of that community. Even with the rise of Protestant dissenting groups like the Quakers and the Baptists, these are minor groups in comparison to the Church of Scotland, which, by and large, if you're not a member of one of these other groups or one of these kind of intellectual atheists of the period, then you're a member of the Church of Scotland by default. Today, that is definitely not the case, and the Church of Scotland has a declining membership. It's really struggling to deal with it, largely because whilst there is a what would you call it? There's a lot of older members in the church, not many younger members. And so as these older members are either finding it too difficult to come anymore or are passing on to their heavenly reward, there's not a replacement of membership, nor is it growing. It's actually significantly declining. At the same time, our culture is now has many religions in it, not just multiple Christian denominations, but other religions such as Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and so on. And in fact, many people now identify as either non-religious or as humanists or atheists. So it does raise questions about the significance of this declaration in this time, given that back then the Church of Scotland had a predominant place within the culture. It no longer does now. So is this oath really required, especially as it doesn't seem that any monarch has any plans to influence the governance or the structures of the churches. Indeed, Elizabeth II had very little input into the Church of England over her reign. It was largely, although she would do the formal processes of maybe passing on or ratifying appointments, in actual fact, it was largely an in-house matter. So I think that does raise questions about the future of this oath, its significance, because it meant something back when it was the majority religion. It doesn't really mean as much now in a real sense. It has this historical symbolic meaning, and it does have a significance for the history of Great Britain. But for the actual institution, I'm not sure it's that important anymore. Especially because we've seen within the Church of Scotland itself. I know that for many of you this will be rather parochial, but the Church of Scotland itself has adapted its own structures, and what it has now is not fully Presbyterian anymore, and so there's questions about whether it's upholding its own end of the bargain on this front. Let's see. Oh, and I'll just go through a couple of questions very quickly. So Ethan McBride, wasn't the Queen's coronation the first in televised form? Yes, but what I'm referring to is not the coronation, but the accession ceremony, which is different. The coronation of Charles III will take place later, probably this year. But that's not happened yet. The accession ceremony is something which happens within the Privy Council. And it's essentially affirming all of these acts of constitution. Let's see. Yeah, so we mentioned the Covenanters earlier. Good to see so many of you. Hello, John Boy. Hello, Jay Burden. Hello, Vingle. Nice to see you all, chaps. Vehement, Spinley, Duke Valentino. Let's see. Bringing it to modern times, where does the Church of Scotland land on the independence debate? Does it care? Officially speaking, the Church of Scotland during the independence referendum of 2014, was it? 2012? Let's see. Well, it officially took a neutral position, declaring that it wouldn't advise its members to vote one way or another. It sorry, I'm just trying to find the actual date. 2014, that's right. And I was actually there during it. I lived in Edinburgh during that period, and it was quite a surreal experience. And yeah, it was quite tense. It was very tense. But yeah, so the Church of Scotland officially took a neutral position. It didn't with Brexit. It said that we should vote for Remain. I think, though, it's an interesting one. Within the Church of Scotland, it's a broad church, right? It covers every parish in Scotland, every area in Scotland. So you're going to have some areas which are very hardcore unionist, some other areas where there's going to be independence supporters. I do get the impression that there was a significant number of folks higher up in the hierarchy who would have been pro-independence, but they didn't come forth with that. And certainly we can see that with the idea that many of them wanted to remain within the European Union and not leave. I think also as well, there's but see, it's a tricky one. The Church of Scotland has this weird situation where it's the national church, and it's got to engage with the Scottish National Party. It doesn't tend to be overly critical of the Scottish National Party because of its precarious position within Scottish society. It doesn't want to anger the real power broker. It will attack Westminster governments over its policies quite vociferously, but in Scotland it doesn't seem to. Whether that's actually just playing the politics of the situation, or if it's actually people support the Scottish National Party quite strongly, I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think though at the end of the day, what's interesting is, whereas in the past, so like with the Act of Union, the Church of Scotland's political position was important back then because it represented the majority of the population. If the Church of Scotland had continued to officially oppose the Act of Union, it probably wouldn't have happened. Or it would have been very difficult to get the consent of the people for it if they hadn't been on board. Today, it doesn't matter in the same way. And that's just the reality of it. If the Church of Scotland opposes independence, it probably won't affect things too much. So, and that reflects changes in society and the kind of individualism we have today as well. But yeah, so it's an interesting question, and there's so many directions we could take this in the future. But thank you for your question, Michael Noctor. I think, let me just check. Yep. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in today. I think this has been a whistle stop tour through Scottish church history and British constitutional uh, ceremony. I hope you've learnt something. I hope that you now have a better understanding of why Charles III made this promise. And just so you know, for the future, I'm hoping every Tuesday, pretty much between 7 and 9, whether that's 8 till 9 or 7 till 9 or 7 till 8, to run streams in the future. And they'll be of a different character each week, although there'll be a kind of monthly calendar for them. Next week, I've got something really exciting. We're going to be talking about English Restorationism, the revival of English culture. I've got two wonderful guests who are going to be there. I have got Rupert August and Daughter of Albion. So it promises to be a fantastic, intriguing, and hopefully encouraging and inspiring discussion. Till then, God bless you all. Good night.